Welcome to the Comics Grid webinar series, Live Chats on Comics Scholarship. Today we will be discussing graphic science and narrative drawing with Lydia Wysocki and Paul Fisher Davies, both authors of two Comics Grid articles published in 2018 as part of the journal's Comic Scholarship Graphic Science Special Collection. Lydia Wysocki is an educational researcher at Newcastle University, using sociocultural theory to explore how what people read influences how they understand the social world. She founded and leads Apply Comics, etc., working with subjects specialists and comics artist writers to make comics that communicate specific information. Today, she will be discussing her Comics Grid article, Partly in Jellyfish and Synergistic Opportunities, the Story and Evaluation of Newcastle Science Comic. Paul Fisher Davies gained his PhD in 2017 in the School of English at the University of Sussex. His monograph, Comics as Communication, a Functional Approach, was published by Palgrave in December 2019. He has published in Studies in Comics, the Journal of Graphic Novels and Comics, and the Comics Grid, amongst others, including academic work in comic form. He currently teaches English language at East Sussex College in Lewes, UK, as well as studying and writing about graphic narrative form. He has written a collection of graphic short stories with previews archived on his blog. I will post a link of his blog shortly. And today he will be discussing his Comics Grid article, Enacting Graphic Mark Making, a review of a theory of narrative drawing. I will post the links to of the articles in the chat, and then at the end we are going to leave some time for a Q&A session. So if you have any questions to the speaker, just post them in the chat, and then we will discuss them at the end. I will hand over to Nicolas, who will introduce the speakers and moderate the discussion. Nicolas Labarre from the Université Bordeaux Montaigne, not sure about my pronunciation in French. So he's the editor of the Graphic Science Special Collection, published in the Journal of Comics Scholarship, which is a prize-winning open access journal published by the Open Library of Humanities. And I hope that you enjoy the session and engage in the discussion afterwards. So, hi, Nicolas.
Hi, Paula. So, I hope you can hear me clearly. So it's a great pleasure to be moderating this discussion, and so the point is not to try to cover everything that can be said about graphic science and comics as scholarship, and we'll come back perhaps to the definitions and to the labels. But to try and see how specific choices were made and how both Lydia and Paul ended up doing this kind of comic scholarship. So perhaps I should start with a question to you both, an introductory question, which is, quite simply, how did you decide to try your hands at this still unusual format for scholarship?
You should go first.
Go on, Paul.
Oh, have I volunteered myself? Okay.
Yeah, go on.
It was partly Ernesto's fault. And partly the challenge of the book itself. So I hadn't seen many graphic narrative reviews. I'd seen and created a couple of academic articles, but hadn't seen a review attempted in graphic narrative. And I think I'd put my hand up and volunteered to write a review of Simon Grennan's Theory of Narrative Drawing. And for those who've read it, you'll know it's a challenging work. It's very, very good, but quite dense and demanding of the reader. Though part of what it steers to is the importance of drawing and the uniqueness of drawing, and how drawing, gesture, making marks on a page, wanting to do something and then doing it by drawing it, is kind of at the heart of this work. So I was a little daunted to try and write a 1,000-word review that would do it justice. Esther Zepp's review is probably your best bet if that's what you're looking for. So I wondered, can I draw it? Can I have a go at sort of enacting graphic mark making? That was Ernesto's phrase eventually, and sort of going towards what the book steers to at the end, which is drawing practice. So I pitched it to Ernesto, said, would this be a crazy idea? And of course it would, but he said, yeah, do it. And so I was encouraged by him to try it out, and it's very much an attempt. I don't think this is the only way, nor probably the best way of doing a review, but I wanted to do it to try it, and also because my own thinking about comics suggests that one should be able to, if comics are communication, that's the title of my monograph, then they shouldn't be limited to narratives, but should be capable of doing scholarly work. So it was a test in many ways.
That's really interesting, Paul. For me, some similarities and some differences. So for me, the Newcastle Science Comics project, which is what I'm talking about in the Comics Grid article, that had been a project about making comics to communicate science in very, very broad view of what science is. And I'd done very little drawing as part of those projects. I'd worked with an awful lot of very skilled and dedicated collaborators. So I thought, well, it made sense for the project. And I think for me, the two things kind of went together. Doing something in comics form, having just been through a big and long project about the benefits of communicating academic stuff through comics and making very complex things accessible. But also as an open access journal, I think that idea of who is going to be reading this at the end of the day was just central to this project. So I think doing the comics form, I've been wanting to write an article about this project and try and summarize many years of work into an article in some way. And seeing that this call was pitched as broadly as graphic science, I thought, yeah, that makes sense. And for an open access journal, I thought, actually, that's a good place to put a comic as something that really is trying to get more practitioners or more scholars who are not necessarily interested in comics in an academic sense, or just people who think, oh, I'll give it a try. That was the kind of audience that we've been getting from the Science Comics project. So seeing some of that language reflected in the call for papers, it made sense to do it as a comic.
So I do have a follow-up question, Lydia. So the comics you did for the Newcastle I don't know if you can see on my screen, if it's large enough, but that's the spineless, which happens to be on my desk. And it was about communicating science. It was about explaining, making science accessible. So my question is, do you draw a distinction between what you did in the article and the project, the spineless and assorted projects that you did for the Newcastle Science Comics? Is that a continuum, or are these two distinct activities?
I'd say overlapping, a bit distinct and a bit similar. So for the Science Comics projects, they weren't about my own research, they were about other scholars' research communicated through comics. So in most cases, that research was quite far advanced. There were some publications, some were fairly new projects, others had been going on for a number of years. And then my role and the role of the team of 6 editors was putting those science researchers together with comics creators and helping them get through that process of how to make a comic communicating some of that science. Whereas I think what I've tried to do in the article is more where I am now as a researcher, so social science, interdisciplinary, social science, arts and humanities. It's quite about as broad as it gets, I think. So there is still a science method and a rigor, which I think there is in pretty much all research. There's that exploratory element, but there is that methodology there as well. So it's not science in the same sense of natural, physical, biological sciences, which most of the science comics content is. But yeah, I'd still put it as social science. Yeah, does that adequately answer what you were asking?
Yeah, I think it does, but I was also asking a question about the genre. That is there a difference between accounting for your own ongoing research, the way you did in the article, and trying to perhaps encapsulate a broader field, the way it seems to me that most articles in most pieces in Spineless and Asteroid Belters try to recapitulate research which in a way has been done, as opposed to ongoing research. Your mic is off, Lydia.
Thanks. There's a couple of exceptions maybe where there's, or at least at the time, there were invitations to take part in citizen science type projects or have a go yourself. But yeah, you're right, Nicholas, it was mostly communicating science that had been done. And then I think for the article, it was looking back on this, some of it was telling the story of this project across the multiple comics anthologies, and then some of it was presenting that new data from the evaluations that we did.
And this is a question to both of you, still on this issue of boundaries. I'm very interested in the issue of naming. We called the collection, we had a long discussion about how to call the collection to have an expensive label that would not put off anyone, basically willing to try his or her hand at doing something that looked like what we had in mind. So I was calling them Comics as Scholarship at that time. I think Ernesto came up with a graphic science, or maybe it was Peter. And so my question is, how do you have a name for what you do, and why? So perhaps Paul, you could go first.
Sure, yeah. I've used graphic scholarship in the past. I did a conference at Sussex in 2016 under that title, and I think Lydia was there presenting, and a few other people from graphic medicine and so on. Yeah, the idea of comics as scholarship, I think, is useful, or graphic scholarship I think is useful term for these things. But there is a certain amount of ambiguity in, calling it graphic scholarship rather than comics as scholarship, if you know what I mean, because comics scholarship is what we call the entire field, and so graphic scholarship sounds like it could just be the study of comics rather than the study of anything through comics. So yeah, that's a bit of a challenge. I think graphic scholarship is kind of fine. I imagine graphic science, I think Ernesto has a flair for naming things, is to align it with graphic humanities and graphic medicine and so on and so forth. My article was initially called, and I think it is in the title page, just a review of Simon Grennan's theory of narrative drawing. I can't remember who said that a graphic novel is a novel, full stop. So similarly, a graphic review is just a review. I get the idea of adding to it the sort of enacting graphic mark making, which does capture the sort of extra thing that it does. Sort of, it's putting your money where your mouth is, as it were. I think Lydia was getting to this as well. If you claim that comics should be able to do this, then go on, do it. So it was a certain enacting. I might have called it Review Demonstration 1 after Simon Grennan's drawing demonstrations as well. So that would have been possible too.
Yeah, I think graphic science makes a lot of sense as a name for this collection. For the projects I've done, where it has this, partly because the science comics were funded through our university, Newcastle University, as part of public engagement around the British Science Festival. So having science in the title was quite obvious. I think that's a festival that, although it does have a very broad understanding of what science is, it is more towards physical, natural, biological sciences, medical sciences as well. So I think my mind would immediately go to that side of science rather than a broader understanding of social science and even all of academic knowledge from the phrase graphic science. But I think I would still ultimately get to the same place. I think it's a really good point of entry. I quite like the word comics. I think it says what it is. I respect that at times, especially for journals and for academic advancement, funding, careers, it's useful to have that finer grained detail. But I quite like comics as a point of entry. I think it's a welcoming place to start.
And this is a near perfect transition to the next subject I wanted to broach. So when I started doing comics as scholarship, I worked with a colleague and we sent an article to a journal and they answered in one line. We published articles in a more traditional form. And even though the article hadn't been peer-reviewed or in any way subjected to academic examination, it was just summarily dismissed as being improper. So this is my next question. Do you have the same experience or perhaps the same fear? Were there circumstances in which the idea of doing work in unconventional format somehow degraded that work from an institutional standpoint or devalued it?
Oh, shall I start on this one, Paul? For my institution, that hasn't come up. I think it's something that it was in my mind thinking, how are people going to take to this work? What's the response going to be? What are the career prospects of, to make an article in comics form? But for me, this was the first academic article I'd published. And for me, it was part of getting from a professional job into an academic job. So I felt like, well, you know what, let's give it a try. And I think I felt that way from the baseline of having done a project and gathered this evidence that, this works. So in terms of my institution, maybe I've just been lucky that the two successive public engagement professionals who've supported the project have been completely on board and there's been no pushback in that sense. And when my article, since then it's been through our latest research review process through my school, which is education, and again actually got reviewed quite well. For those in the UK, it got 3 stars, which I know that is not the be all and end all in any sense, but it got through ref fine. And I got a really lovely email from one of the administrators going, oh, we quite like discussing that one. It was a bit of a change. So some of that, I wonder if that's to do with being in an institution where there has been a particular push for that public engagement with science. Also in an education department where there is a lot of work on visual methods or arts-based methods within research anyway. So it's maybe not that big a jump. But Paul, I'd be interested in what your experiences have been.
I haven't dared pitch a graphic form piece of scholarship to anything that's not comics based and I know would be receptive to it, so I just haven't butted my head against that. What I did do a couple of times is gently bring up to my supervisors the idea of doing my PhD as a graphic narrative in the way that I think Bruce Mutard in Australia has just completed an amazing looking piece of work, a PhD as a graphic narrative, and of course Nick Souzanis is the famous innovator there. But that was immediately met with consternation, even from people at Sussex University, which is supposed to be quite kind of creative and interdisciplinary, and within a literature and visual culture PhD with a supervisor or supervisors who are both really into visuality. The idea of actually doing a PhD as a comic just immediately panicked them, probably rightly so, given the sort of challenge for me doing it. But it did feel like that wasn't something that was really up for discussion. It was closed down pretty rapidly in my institution.
That's interesting. So for me, I'm in the writing up stage of my PhD at the moment, And what I've been doing all the way through is use comics in terms of participant information sheets, recruitment materials, debrief materials, a questionnaire. So there's bits of comics in there. And what I've been talking about with my supervisors is doing something, I don't want to commit to this, something like a chapter summary in comics form, but I don't have the intention to do the whole comic in comics form. And there were times when they were actually getting quite, I think maybe I'd shown them Nick's Unflattening book quite early on in the process, and they went, oh, that's quite good, that. So it's kind of saying, actually, how far do I want to go down that route, and how far do I still want to do a traditionally written piece of work?
What I did do was to squeeze bits of comics in terms of diagrams in particular, drawn ways of getting across ideas. Thinking in terms of shapes and tables and structures and so on was kind of key to my thinking, and so there's a couple of my drawings in the thesis which then becomes the book. But yeah, I didn't get to the point where I had a whole section where I switched into comics mode and told the entire story through comics. Rather, it was something that was comics-like, or at least visual in terms of diagrammatical, and then that framed my discussion of the comic.
I mean, it's been my experience that as an experiment, these articles and pieces are generally welcome to generate curiosity. And what you were describing, Lydia, people are pleased that to have this as a, I was going to say as a distraction, but as something that forces them to look at research in a slightly different way, and that's absolutely positive. But then when you try to make this when you try to enact a cultural shift, when you try to make this a regular practice, then it becomes much more difficult, unless somehow you get to a sort of critical mass of people willing to invest in the practice, or things like the Comics Grid, an institution which is devoted to welcoming experimentation and which make the act of experimenting part of its publishing creed. And for what it's worth, I do think that the internationalization of comic studies makes this easier, because even if there are small niches in which you can publish these articles, they are accessible to everyone, creators and readers. So it's much easier to find the people and to reach that critical mass in one institution. Yeah, Paul?
I was just going to chip in Sequentials, the comics form journal, which is online and open and available to people, which is just exclusively doing scholarship in comics form. Not only scholarship about comics in comics form, but all sorts of themes have been invited by that. So I think the more we get those kinds of things and the more they're visible to people, the better. I was trying to think of the name of the journal in France that's news journal or kind of reportage. It's called something like the Revue Dessinée. Do you know this?
Yeah, La Revue Dessinée and 21 does a lot of graphic reporting as well.
Yeah, so I mean, those kinds of things can also standardize and normalize that approach, as well as giving a forum for people to experiment with the form. And I think we are still at an experimental stage, just finding out what we can do and what this kind of register would be like in comics.
Absolutely, but there's an interesting thing about the La Revue Dessinée is that a lot of academics contribute to the publication, but they do so while not having their usual institutional role. That is, they try. Usually, their work is about their research, but they will be presented as contributing academics as opposed to academics doing their work, their usual work. So it's a slightly different positioning, and Sequentials does that as well. That is, Sequentials explicitly invites articles which are not academic. So academic articles, but also non-academic investigations into graphic issues. So there is an unwillingness to locate this firmly as an academic practice, or perhaps an unwillingness to enclose it and to make it just an academic practice. So which is why I was asking about boundaries earlier, because it seems to me that this is one field in which truly it's difficult, if not impossible, to isolate something that would be specifically academic the way you can isolate academic articles and journals, and the way it's important for academic journals to be described as such and to have their own rules, their own jar. I don't think we have quite that for graphic science.
It's making me think also of, though I didn't push it too much with my institution, and I've tended to seek out journals that I know will be open to comics, just when putting together my academic CV, it's hard to know where and how to put such a thing as a graphic review, because there might be a whole separate section for creative work, and then there's scholarly work. And so what do you do with a comic that is in scholarly journal, and it's doing scholarly stuff, but it's still a comic? Yeah, even that space being slightly formalized presents challenges for where we're going to put this work.
Absolutely. So I had a tiny icon next to mine to my graphic articles. So my next, I like to perhaps focus more on the actual pieces, and I'd like to ask you if you could talk about the process of creating these pieces, because this is part of one of the usual challenges when discussing comic scholarship is, what if I can't draw? And how do I revise this? How do you work? So I know that both of you have a quite detailed presentation of your process, so maybe I'll just yield the floor.
Lydia, do you want to go first, actually?
Yeah, that's fine. Just let me get the sharing share application. There we go. Nope, sorry, mine isn't doing it.
If you're having difficulties, I can go.
Yeah, could you go and I'll try and sort this out? Sorry.
Okay, sure. So let me try my sharing thing and see if that's going to work. What I do is I work digitally, at least, and I largely work digitally for this kind of scholarship, which I know is going to be deliberately for publication. I tend to do sketchnoting in analog form, just live with a pen or pens, a brush pen, right there on a physical book. But because of the possibility of editorial intervention, working digitally for comic scholarship has been my main way of working. That also means that I can play back the strokes as they were made. If this will share correctly, you should be able to see a window here, and I'm hoping that you can see video playing, and this is sort of the running order in which I put it. Good, thank you, Paula. So yeah, I kind of dived in here, building from my notes, which would be the basis for writing a full review, and putting it into comics form. I could do little more in terms of the wording than present those notes, and often I had to cut those down. And so I'm just finding my way. As you can see, I have a grid in the background, which is a kind of standard grid that I work from, a 9-panel grid, which I'll then sort of cut up and shift around as I go. And I'll switch between writing, usually it's been writing first, and then kind of drawing alongside. Sometimes drawing comes first, sometimes skipping from one to the other. And yeah, it just kind of leaps forward like this. much slower than this, of course. This is considerably quicker than it actually happens. And then at the end here, there's sort of all sorts of bits of recasting and rewriting, supporting material, changing some of the wording so I can kind of edit before even the first draft is done in this way. Jeanette Darcy asks, what am I using to record the process? This was done in Adobe Sketch, I think, on an iPad, though I also, for other work, use Procreate, and those just offer you the possibility of exporting as a video your strokes, because it is recording your strokes in the file as a matter of course, just for allowing you to undo, for example, and then it gives you this sort of benefit of being able to just play it back. Often some interesting decisions that took quite a lot of quite a lot of thought, and that I might have come back to considerably later, just sort of passed by in the blink of an eye when viewing this kind of material. So it's not a perfect reflection of the process, but it gives you some sense of the choices that I make and some of the affordances of digital. As you see, I'm doing a sort of draw over here of Matt Madden. In some cases, I've used the original stuff and then cut areas out or drawn over photographs or whatever, just to get reference and make sure that things are more or less accurate. There's hi Garen. So this can roll on in the background. If you have any questions about this, Nicholas, then do chip in. Otherwise,
I do have a question. So you don't have any you don't have any preliminary thumbnails or anything to pre-organize your thoughts?
I note in written form first. I don't thumbnail, or at least I didn't for this one on the whole, partly because it's digital. I can kind of improvise as I go, and even when I've done longer form drawing in the past, I'll sort of thumbnail full size, as in I'll sketch very, very lightly right across a whole range of pages, and I'll go back and erase that and draw over it and work on the thing itself. I kind of, just as my own working practice, I need to just work rapidly, because otherwise it won't get done. And maybe this also comes from coming at this in part from the practice of sketchnoting, where you can forget about planning ahead and thumbnailing and so on. You've just got to draw and do it really, really quickly. I'm sure it might be better if I planned in more detail. And when I've done collaborative stuff, it has been a bit more planned and organized on the larger scale. But largely I've sort of worked things out as I would with a written article, from an overall framework, key points that I want to make, and then I'm thinking as I go in terms of putting it into its pages and its spaces and so on.
So how long would you say it took you to do the whole piece?
Let me unshare this, because you don't want to be looking at that. How long did it take me to do it? Like I say, I work quite rapidly. It really depends what you count. I can draw out a basic page quite quickly, within an hour or so, but then looking for the reference material might take longer. I'll go back and I'll edit afterwards, which is not revealed in that automatic playthrough. There's big pauses in the middle there. So it's quite hard to answer that. Several hours, but not as long as some people. I work quite rapidly. I saw a couple of questions in chat there. Ernesto asks, is the lettering hand-drawn or is it font type? It's hand-drawn, probably to a fault. Sometimes I'll go back and actually redraw it because the writing is quite scribbly and sketchy. I quite like that, but I'm aware that it might be a barrier to readers. The personal touch in handwriting, I think, is quite important to comics. It's facture, marks of facture, to use Simon Grennan's terms, I think is quite important in terms of humanizing scholarship. And I've tried creating a font. Linda asks, do I use a font based on my handwriting? I hate it. Now it doesn't look like my handwriting anymore. So the closest I'll do, and I didn't include there, is when I'll do bibliography that is worked on and edited and then printed out, and then I will trace over with my own handwriting. I'm sure it would be cleaner if I did a font based on my handwriting. but I haven't done it. I need to just become a better letterer.
So, yeah, I do have perhaps a final question. You said several hours. Is it the same range that it would have taken you to write the same review in a traditional form? I mean, not the exact same time, obviously, but roughly a similar time? Or would you say it takes twice as long to do it in graphic form, or any other of magnitude?
There's a balance there. I partly chose to do it in graphic form, as I said, as a sort of experiment, and because the challenge of doing justice to the book in a standard format just felt rather daunting. So I thought if I try to do it in a drawn form, then that replaces the one challenge with a different kind of challenge. Probably for 3 pages, about the same amount of time that it would have taken. Because you are massively limited in the number of words you can use and the number of points you can make. So actually, as a review, squeezed into 3 pages, I can only sort of point to some of the key things about the book, right? I can pick out some things that are happening, but they are rather note form in order to make it sort of bite-sized. I wonder what a review would look like if you spent 10 pages on it, and whether anybody would publish a 10-page review of any written book. So yeah, the time can expand or contract depending on the length of the piece and depending what you aim to do. But my aim was to spend about the amount of time that I would have spent on a 500 or 1,000 word review.
Lydia, did you solve the screen sharing problem?
I did, but also just to say, Paul, I'm impressed if you can do that in the same time or equivalent time of what you were thinking for writing. For me, I think it would have been 1.5, maybe twice as long, because I think thinking through where the panels are, what I can take out of text and put into image, I felt like it was taking longer. So yeah, hats off if you can do it in the same time. It's good.
I just do it by doing it badly, so then it can fit into the same
time. Let's celebrate doing things as whatever works at the moment, isn't it? We're all in such strange circumstances. Right, I don't have a video. I have some images at various stages of my process. So what's on the left here is notes from what was the first group planning meeting of the science comics project that underpins the article. And as I think you can see, there is quite a neat handwritten list of dates, tasks, and then there's a lot of post-its and scribble on top. And on the right, that's one of our the detritus after one of our project editors meetings. I did want to show some of the initial scribbly notes before I got to actually writing the article, but I don't know where they are. They might be on campus, they might be lost in the recycling bin. But this kind of idea I wanted to get across, that right from the very start of a project, there is spreadsheets, lists, Word documents and planning, but there's also a lot of scribbling and diagrammatical bits and notes as well. This is a snippet of what I sent to Nicholas and Ernesto as the initial pitch for the article. So it ended up as about a 9-page Word document, mostly bullet points, and trying to set out what are the different sections of the article. Also linking across to an example of the style that I wanted to use, like black and white with some photo images dropped in as well, mostly. This is a comparison of, on the left, that's the first version of the first page of the article, and on the right, that's the final version of that same page. So I think there's a couple of bits that didn't make it into the last final version, but mostly it's just to show that things got moved around. Similar to what Paul was saying about his process, there is quite a regular grid underpinning this. In my case, it was 4 by 5, which is a lot of panels on a page. Yeah, so some intentionally leaving spaces for images to be dropped in later, and other parts that just got got shifted around as part of the editing. And I also must say a big thank you to Britt Coxon, who was one of the co-editors for the Science Comics project, and also, as it says in the acknowledgements of the article, was brilliant on Photoshop at a point where I think I'd used Photoshop once at that point. So the final article, the abstract is in text form, and then as a comparison, the article itself is in comics form, which I think is in some ways the opposite of what's fashionable. There is a bit of a trend at the moment for having an abstract in comics form or graphic diagrammatical form, but then the rest of the article is text only and is typically behind a paywall as well. So I find that I'm never quite sure what to make of graphic abstracts. I think it's a nice way to try and get the scholarship out to different audiences, but then I wonder if people click on it thinking they're going to see the rest of the article in comics form as well. But yeah, yeah, and that's just a few links for where other things have come from. But in terms of my process, it's much more analog than Paul's. I think for me it's more about spending the time figuring out what goes where, and then trying to make some sense of what was, at times it was a fairly chaotic project, and all the better for it. So I'll stop sharing and come back.
So you mentioned that you admired Paul for his ability to draw as fast as he would write. I share that feeling, but how long would you say it took you to complete the piece? Again, I realize it's difficult to account for everything, but the time you spent doing the graphic piece itself, perhaps including the preparation and the actual drawing and re-edit and I think your microphone is off.
Oh, sorry. I'm not used to Blackboard. I'm more of a Zoom and Teams is my life at the moment. I'm not sure how to quantify that preparation phase. Like for me, it was a project that kind of from 2012 onwards, and then the article was published in 2018. So I'm not going to say it took 6 years in the preparation, but it did take a while. And I think various early ideas of what could become an article, yeah, not too sure about that. In terms of actually putting things on paper, preparation phase, I think it was mostly fitted in evenings around my day job at the time then. I'd say it was a good couple of weeks of evenings, not necessarily in a consecutive block, but to get that initial draft done and get to the point of sending in that submission. Then in terms of putting the pages together, I think it ended up as 9-10 pages all in. That I'd say was another couple of weeks of evenings again. There were times where I could get a couple of pages drawn in an evening from having quite a handwriting, simplistic drawing style. Yeah, sorry, that doesn't quite answer it, Nicholas. I'm not quite sure how to put numbers onto it. It was a funny process.
If I could join in, I also find it quite hard. You know, I've said about the same time, but I lose track of time when I'm drawing, and so things just sort of fly by. And I think it's been 10 minutes, but maybe it's been an hour. And you know, I also needed to read the book and do the notes, and then edit down the notes to think about what I can fit into comics form. Plus, the review is much simpler project than Lydia's, much longer, multi-sectioned, collaborative communication of an entire project. So it was much easier for me to just sort of find my way with what I'd already read and sort of preformed thoughts about it. And when I've done collaborative work, that has taken significantly longer with the sort of to and fro with a fellow writer and or artist, stretching out to several weeks or months.
Yes, again, I was not expecting a very precise answer. I was more interested in the tension between the reward the pleasure of drawing, which I think is crucial to the experience, the curiosity it generates, the attention it can get you, but also the cost, which is editing and revising the piece is painful. It takes much longer to move a panel than to move a paragraph or a sentence. The whole structure can be altered if you have something, if there's something you need to fit in. So there's really a trade-off between what you get by doing these pieces and the extra effort that you have to put into it. But judging from your answers, it seems that the trade-off was acceptable in that it generated more work or specific difficulties, but maybe not to the point of making it impossible to do on a semi-regular basis.
Yeah, I think for me, definitely that trade-off was there, and it was a positive, pleasant, productive experience. The edits weren't too painful, and I think some of that was it was a good team, and it was a constructive dialogue, but also for my part, sticking with quite a simple hand-drawn style. I think I wasn't approaching this as I want to make art in comics form, and I think if I'd been trying to do that in the journal article as well, that's where I think for me things might have started to crumble. I think that's a really tricky balance to get there. Are there questions in the chat? Sorry, I'm getting distracted.
Should we start with the question from the audience during the last 10 minutes? Are you okay with that? I think we have a... Okay, great. So thank you so much for today. It was really, really interesting. We have a question from Lucas Weil, and he's asking, could you perhaps speak a little bit about the importance of, or your possible backgrounds in the important formal education in art, drawing, as well as with the actual media tools, Photoshop, for instance, like graphic design, or would you consider working within actual comic scenes as a kind of education itself? How about others in graphic scholarship? Any ideas? Who would like to go first?
Thanks, Lucas. I'll try and speak to that. I didn't go to art school. I don't think Lydia did either. My background is in English literature and then media studies and so on. But I always loved to draw, and I always loved comics, and so that has been sort of brought in to the scholarship rather than the scholarship being brought to the comics creation. And no formal education in tools like Photoshop. It's just learning it myself and YouTube videos and just trying out and seeing what works with me. Actually, is trying lots of different apps and seeing which ones are free or very affordable and fit in with my workflow. I'm not sure quite what you mean about working within actual comic scenes as a kind of education itself. So do elaborate on that.
Yeah, I was taking that to mean like DIY, small press publishing, having a go, making comics as a practitioner, rather than being trained in any particular design tools. For me, no art school. I did a BA in history, masters in education, now partway through a PhD in education, and a bit of English language teaching at earlier stages. And for me, it was in the teaching that actually seeing that even the worst drawing on a whiteboard, when your whiteboard pen is running out of ink, that's a really powerful way of communicating information. And for me, it's that idea of what language can do, whether it's in visual, verbal, whatever form. Getting the communication across and doing that planning, I think, is the crucial part for me. That in some ways the surface level of drawing and what it looks like at the final draft, for me, it's an important consideration, but I think unless the underpinnings are there, it may well, that's where it can fail as a comic, I think.
If I could try to speak.
Would you like to say anything, Paul? Sorry, I interrupted.
Sorry, I just want to speak to Lucas's last question there about others in graphic scholarship and working with other people in graphic scholarship. I have contributed to sequentials, so I've done other work like that and had sort of twos and fro's with editors wanting to change things, and that's quite a challenge when it's a composed structure on a page-by-page basis. So hence the advantage of doing things in digital. And I know that brought up on the comic scholars list was the question about how do you, and this speaks to Elizabeth's next question, how do you make a judgment as a peer reviewer about a comic in graphic form? And it's something of a challenge. I think it's easier to add things than recast things. So occasionally I've been asked to add a page of introduction or abstract, which is easy enough to do, and add a bibliography, for example, which is easy enough to do. But if you were asked to sort of rearrange the panels, though like Lydia, I had a kind of grid behind that, and I saw that Lydia was doing some rearranging in the sort of planning phases, that would be much trickier to more radically rework a piece of scholarship in graphic.
So Ernesto is inviting me perhaps to add something to this idea of academic rigor. So one thing that we did for the collection, because we really tried to come up with original solutions for this, was to try to have to encourage authors, contributors to send us first drafts and thumbnails and incomplete versions that they could revise more freely without having to put in all the extra labor. So there's an article which by Matteo Farinella of Microscopes and Metaphors. I might be getting the words in the wrong order, which is beautifully drawn, but we did all the revisions on the preliminary sketches, which made it possible to really work on the structure and what he was trying to do. So there was a lot of editorial work involved before the peer reviewing process, and basically this is the case in which we sent the articles for peer review at a point where we were satisfied that we had polished off the rough edges. And we also asked peer reviewers to focus on content and perhaps think about the implications of changing some elements, think of the labor it would involve to change the elements. So to focus on things that could be changed easily if they could, while not of course refusing serious changes if they were needed, but to ask them to pay attention to the labor involved.
So I think we have 3 minutes left. So if you have one last question, anybody for one last question for the last 3-4 minutes?
I think Esther had put a question in earlier.
Where?
Esther said, so the flow and the temporal experience of drawing is significantly different for you from the flow provided by thinking and writing. For me, it's different. I'm not sure it's significantly different. But I think for me, a lot of my early notes, even when I'm making notes from the reading or from the analysis that I'm doing, there is a diagrammatic image type element to those notes as well. I think at some point it becomes more of a comic or more of a written piece. I think maybe what counts as a line break or a paragraph break, that I find a bit trickier to do in drawing. I think for me the drawings all become quite closely linked, whereas in text I find it easier to tease those separate ideas apart.
Pages and titles, intertitles, possibly do that kind of work. But yeah, you need to think in terms of a page as a unit. It's almost like a paragraph conceptually.
Can I just ask your question to Lydia? Lydia, what happened after the completion of the research project and the publication? Did the museums and the festivals you collaborated with continue to explore this sort of practices as part of their public engagement strategy?
Yeah, some of them did. So the university's involvement in that festival, the university ended up taking on more of that science communication in-house rather than waiting for this annual festival to roll. again. So actually, yeah, there've been quite a few follow-on projects, not part 2 of any given comics, but I do still get people saying, oh, actually, we've got a bit of funding, can you help me get in touch with someone? I've just finished a project called Applied Comics Collaborations, and that project is more about getting those projects started. So it's been really nice. Isn't this always the problem with academia? Sometimes it takes a few years for those connections to really pay off and for people to have time to digest something and figure out what it means for their own work and where it can go.
Yes, exactly. That's why I was asking you, because I know that the project was completed. When was it? In 2012?
So the first anthology was published in 2013, and then the second big anthology was published 2015. So it was a while ago. Yeah. Yes, Ernesto.
It started in 2012, right?
Yeah. It's been a while.
I can't believe it's 5 already. It's been an hour already. Thank you so much. It's been great, super interesting. Time has absolutely flown, and I hope you enjoy the session. And see you next time.